Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us again for the next webinar in Elevate's Parent Webinar Series. I hope everyone is keeping well. I hope everyone is warm. It has been absolutely freezing in Cape Town recently, so I hope wherever you are, you're doing well and your family and friends as well. Obviously, it is a challenging period at the moment. I know that our old friend load shedding has returned. I know that there are kind of whispers of potential restrictions coming back in, and the third wave has been announced. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to join us. And as always, I really hope you find this evening's webinar informative. Having said that, I know that there is a bit of heat that is on everyone at the moment in the way of tests and exams. I know that for a lot of students, they're starting tests and exams this week. Some students are starting writing next week. So hopefully you'll find this evening is very good timing as well. For those of you who don't know me, perhaps this is the first webinar that you've joined that we've run at Elevate. My name is Adam Diprose and I'm the General Manager of Elevate here. So a very warm welcome to you if it's your first time joining one of our webinars. And for our seasoned veterans, thank you so much for joining us again. Hopefully the fact that you've come back means that you found the last webinars that we've run helpful. For those who are playing at home, this is the 5th webinar that we've run this year. And as a bit of context, we started running these free webinars early last year when lockdown started. And one of the reasons for that is that Elevate has always worked with students. We've always done a lot of work with teachers, and we have done a lot of work with parents in the schools that we work with. But one of the big things we found last year was that everything was basically flipped on its head. And I know a lot of parents basically became teachers overnight and that they were supporting their children at home. So we decided that we would do whatever we could to provide value to you as parents and to help you out across this journey as well. So thank you so much for joining us again. If you were here with us last webinar 2 weeks ago, I spent a lot of time talking about the process of exam preparation. So what kind of work students should be doing over the last few weeks and the next couple of weeks leading into their exams. This evening's focus is part 2, where I'm going to spend most of my time looking at the exam room itself, looking at tests, and looking at what work students should be doing leading into the final stage before tests and exams and in the exam room itself. So I've dubbed this evening the home stretch. I know it's not quite, we're only midway through the year, but hopefully you'll pick up some really practical tips this evening to help your children, or if you're a student, thank you again for joining us. Hopefully this will help you directly. And obviously for the teachers who've joined us, hopefully there's some things that you can implement with your students over the coming weeks. Now, again, I know that a lot of people will be very familiar with Elevate. We'll do a lot of work in schools of parents who've joined us this evening. You might have attended one of our workshops yourself, but I do know there are some parents who won't be as familiar with Elevate. So just to start with a kind of standard introduction for those of you who aren't as familiar with the work we do. Elevate started 20 years ago now as a research company in Australia, with the aim of finding out what it is that top performing students do in order to do so well. So how do they study? How do they prepare for exams? How do they manage stress? How do they prepare the exam room itself? And over the last 20 years, our work has centered around condensing all of that research into a series of workshops that we then go into schools and we deliver to students and support that with staff training and parent training, and that we run through our one-to-one coaching program where we work with students on an individual basis. My 2 disclaimers for those of you who don't know me is that I am Australian, so I always start by acknowledging that. But I have lived in South Africa now for about 5.5 years and no plans on leaving anytime soon. And my second disclaimer is an important one, that I am not a parent as yet. And I say that because even though I'm very excited about becoming a parent one day, I'm not a parent yet. So one thing I promise you I will not do is tell you how to raise your children or tell you how to parent, because I am the least qualified person in that regard. And I know that at times I can slip into my ideal non-parent world and say something really optimistic, and everyone sitting there is probably laughing, thinking, you just wait, buddy. So please do pull me up if I get into that territory. But essentially, if I had to summarize what Elevate does in a nutshell, it is our firm belief that the best way to learn anything is to find someone who's doing it really well at the moment, find out how they're doing it, and try to model that behavior or replicate those skills. And that's exactly what the work we've done over the last 20 years has been focused on: improving students' confidence, improving students' skills, and ultimately improving their academic performance by teaching them these skills and these techniques. We've got offices now in 5 countries, so South Africa, Australia, the US, the UK, and Singapore. We work with about 3,000 schools across 15 countries. And as you can imagine, we're exposed to some phenomenally interesting, innovative ways that other schools, other organizations are driving effective learning behaviors in the classroom. But we also work with thousands of families on a one-to-one basis where we bring our programs into your home. And as you can imagine, we also pick up some unbelievable ways that parents are supporting their children at home. And the point of these webinars really has been to try to kind of take you behind the curtain and show you some of the research, some of the case studies, but also share some ideas of what other parents are doing to support their children at home. So as a very quick recap, and just one thing that's one of the most frequently asked questions we get, we do record all of these webinars, and you should have received a recording of the last webinar as well. But in case you haven't been able to watch it or you missed the last webinar, as a very quick recap, the big thing that I spoke about in the last webinar on exam preparation was the timeline and the work that top performing students do in the 2 to 3 weeks before the exam. Now, I say 2 to 3 weeks deliberately because one of the things that I always joke about with students is when I say that we are a research company that works with the top students in the country, most people assume the top students started working on the 1st of January and their pre-exam routine involves 6 months of working for 18 hours a day. And one of the really common misconceptions that we try to debunk with students is the top performing students aren't the top students because they're spending significantly more time working. It's because they're spending the time that they are studying doing the right things or doing the most effective things. So what I spoke about last time was the idea of that 3-step process, finishing notes using that syllabus as a checklist, trying to get notes done as soon as possible, moving on to memorizing them through flip cards, flashcards, however students are studying. And the final webinar this term in 2 weeks' time, I'm actually going to spend that entire webinar looking at memory skills, learning styles, different ways for students to process information. And then the final thing we talked about was the idea of practice papers. And I'll spend a little bit of time this evening looking at some specifics around practice exams, practice papers, and what that process should look like in an ideal world. What I'm going to spend time on this evening, though, is I know we're no longer 3 or 4 weeks away. We've had a lot of parents email us and call us across the week saying exams are starting on Wednesday, please help. So I'm going to basically imagine that for most students, they are starting to write quite soon. And we're going to look at that final stretch, the final few days or the final week before tests and exams. I'm also aware, and just as a quick reminder, we work with students from grade 4 all the way to grade 7 at a primary school level, from grade 8 to a matric level at high schools. We also work with university students as well. So I know that exams or tests will mean slightly different things to different students, depending on the age and stage they're at. So I'll try to give advice that spans across the spectrum. And as always, you'll see on the page that you're watching this webinar, the little purple chat box. My colleague Leandri is on standby this evening, so you can say a big hello to Leandri. If you want to send any messages or a shout out, I always find it an interesting social experiment where you're tuning in from this evening. So this evening you can say hi to Leandri and you can use that chat function across the webinar if you do have any questions or comments as we go. Okay, fantastic. Now, for those of you who have joined us before, you would know that it wouldn't be an Elevate webinar without some kind of quiz or some kind of test for you as parents. So I always start with this because as a very genuine point, I think the risk of any external program, whether it's study skills or chartered accountancy or netball coaching, is that someone comes in and gives a very generic talk with a few very, very vague examples, and you walk away going, well, I don't really see how that applies to me. So I always encourage you, as I'm talking over the next kind of 30 or 40 minutes, to think about how this content applies to your child or your children and what you can get out of this evening in terms of practical takeaways. I've been fortunate over the last 12 months to spend that time speaking to parents, to psychologists, to counselors, to principals, to teachers, and to students, obviously. And I've tried to summarize some of the biggest challenges that we hear in the lead up or that final stretch before tests and exams. So what I want to do is just spend a few minutes outlining some of the most common challenges we hear, and then I'm going to spend most of this evening trying to tackle those as we go. So my first question for you is, do you find that your child, your son, your daughter, the students that you teach tend to get moody or a bit defensive as exams come up? So do you find their behavior changes, they get a bit tense, they get a bit on edge, and you can tell very clearly that tests or exams or project season is in the air? So you can just put an answer in the chat box, or you can just make a mental note or write this down on pen or paper. But do you find this is an issue that you're facing with your child? The second question I have for you, and this is a really common one we hear as well, is do you find that your child often stays awake late at night studying or cramming? Often, whether you know it or not, sometimes you only find out the next morning when they're bleary-eyed and you need to ask them the same question 4 times in a row to get a response. But is one of the things that you see that cramming is a big problem with your son or daughter? So the third question is, do you find that the level of general stress or anxiety tends to build in your son or daughter, and often it leads to meltdowns where they become a bit snappy? Some students deal with it in the opposite way, they get a bit detached and withdrawn. But is stress or anxiety one of the concerns that you have or something you see in your son or daughter? There is always a very small minority of parents who sit there going, Adam, I would pay at the moment for my son or daughter to be a little bit more anxious about their exams because they're acting like they don't even exist at the moment. But is that a concern that you're seeing with your son or daughter? Number 4, do you find sleep is an issue, that your son or daughter might go to bed at a reasonable time, but they're up late at night, they're worried, they're playing the scenario over and over again in their head. How am I going to go? What are they going to ask in the exam room? And that tends to impact on their focus or their motivation as well. So is sleep an issue for you? And then the last 2 questions I have, again, a very, very common one, not just for our students, but often for adults in our professional lives as well. Do you find that your son or daughter often struggles to pay attention, or they have mind blanks in the exam room? They'll walk out of the test or they'll walk out of the exam and they'll go, I think that went really well. And then immediately they start thinking of things that they should have put in the exam. And they sit there and say, I learnt that yesterday. How did I leave that out? It just completely slips their mind, or it's on the tip of their tongue and they're trying to think of a date or a quote and they can't quite recall it in the exam room. And the final question, which again, I hope doesn't apply to too many of you, but I'm sure it does for some of you. Does your child just not study at all? They don't really put in much work. They take the old wing it approach of I'll just walk into the exam room or the test and I'll see how I go. And hopefully I get asked every single question that I know the answer to. So I'll give you about 30 seconds. You can pop an answer in the chat box. You can even just give a number based on the one that is the biggest concern with you. And then I'll try to cover all of these points over the next kind of 30 minutes or 40 minutes this evening. I'll try to keep this evening a little bit shorter than last time. I know it's an exceptionally busy time of year at the moment for parents, for teachers, for students, or for working professionals in your own lives. I always use the marker of how many emails start with the words sorry or apologies as a pretty good indication of how busy it is. So I'll try to be wrapped up before 7 o'clock this evening. So just interested to see which of these are the biggest concerns for you or the biggest things you notice in your son or daughter. Okay, so a lot of responses coming in. Okay, so let's start trying to tackle some of these. And as I said, if you do have specific questions as I go through the webinar, you're more than welcome to pop that in the chat. I'll try to get to as many of them as I can this evening. If not, we always do try to follow up and get back to them over the next few days as well. So as a very quick recap of last time, because in 20 years of research, and this isn't an exaggeration when I say this, if the only thing your son or daughter does over the next few days or weeks, if they do one thing, in our research, we found the number one thing that will get them marks is the number of practice questions, past papers, or practice papers or exams they do. So in the kind of week before a test or an exam block, or in the few days before, the biggest thing that you should be encouraging your son or daughter to focus on is practice. Now, two things I just wanted to drill down on that are really, really important is I think the term practice is often really misused amongst students and generally amongst people when they talk about the concept of practice. One of my favorite quotes, if you've seen the documentary The Last Dance about Michael Jordan, one of my favorite quotes is Michael Jordan always said, if you practice with bad technique, if all you do is you shoot 1,000 shots with bad technique, the only thing that happens is you get really, really good at shooting really, really badly. So what we talk about with students is the concept of deliberate practice or intention practice. And as cliched as it sounds, the big message we give to students and we give to parents is if you get the process right, the result tends to take care of itself. And as I said in the last webinar, a big message we give to students in our programs is you don't get your marks in the exam room itself. What I mean by that is you don't tend to earn your marks in the test or in the exam room. You tend to earn your marks through the work you do in the days and the weeks leading up to them. The second thing we find though is that students will often work really hard and they'll do practice, but they'll often do it in a slightly different way that doesn't maximize the work that they're doing or the marks that they'll get. So as a very quick recap, when you walk into your son or daughter's bedroom and you say, how are you doing? Are you ready for your tests? Are you ready for their exams or your exams? And they turn around and say, I'm done, I've finished my notes, or I've learned everything I possibly can. I think the critical question to ask is, have you allocated time to move on to the practice questions? Have you actually worked through them? And then what have you done with them once you've finished them? And what I mean by that is we always encourage students to follow this process. In an ideal world, they should spend as much time as possible, as much of the time in the last week before tests or exams, doing practice questions, doing practice papers, doing past year's exam papers. The problem with that is one of the biggest barriers that students say to us is, oh, mum, dad, I can't start doing practice questions because I haven't finished my notes yet. Or the second thing they'll often say, which is the key one, is I can't move on to practice questions. I just don't know the content well enough. I haven't learned it. I'm worried I'm going to get it wrong. And they very much see practice questions as the very, very final step in the process. So most students end up putting it off. They spend most of their times reading from their textbook or rewriting notes, and they never get around to that high value work of doing the practice questions. So one of the big things we try to do with students when we work with them in our coaching program is we try to remove that anxiety and remove that fear of failure. And it's probably the first time most students ever hear this, but we explicitly tell them that when they start doing practice, they should start by cheating. And what I mean by that is we encourage students to have their notes open next to them. So have their keywords, have their mind maps, have all of their notes next to them, and don't time themselves. So remove that anxiety of, I don't know this question, I forgot how to answer that, I'm under pressure, I've only got an hour to do this, and try to make the practice as normalized as possible, like homework or generally doing revision. The next step is once students get the ball rolling, once they get a bit more comfortable, once they start working through practice questions, we then encourage them to start trying to take their notes away, but still keep that time open and don't put any time pressure on themselves. So as an example, they might go from using their trigger words or their mind maps or their notes or their summaries and then trying to close them, doing the same kinds of questions and seeing if they can now answer those questions without that safety net or that crutch of their notes. And that basically breeds more confidence in students because they're getting more comfortable applying the content and using it in a test or in an exam setting. And then the final step that we move towards is what we call situational learning, where we try to get the students to move towards mimicking a test or an exam environment. Now, I'll use a very, very weird example, a very old school Australian example. If anyone here is a rower, or perhaps if your child rows as well, the Awesome Foursome, Australian folklore, really, really successful rowing crew. One of the things that they used to do is when they were preparing for the Olympics, they used to try to simulate what that race would look like, what it would sound like, what it would feel like, to the point where they would literally sit in a room and they would play themselves recordings of a race environment. So what does the start sound like? What does the fans or the crowd sound like? What does the sound of the oars sound like during a race? And the idea behind that is that when they were in that exam environment, in inverted commas, or that high pressure race environment, it wasn't the first time they'd been exposed to that different stimulus. So it wasn't as overwhelming. They'd dealt with it before. They'd trained their brain to deal with it before. Now, strange example, I know, but think about your children or your child for a second. How often do you hear an example of a student who works really hard, they put in the hours, they're prepared for the test or the exam, and then when they walk into that test room or into that exam hall, they tend to fall apart a little bit? And the reason for that is all of a sudden it becomes very real for them. They're no longer sitting at home in their bedroom listening to music, making notes. They're in a hall. Even the way the room has been set up is quite intimidating. The invigilator stands up and in that really formal voice goes, "You may now turn over your paper." The students sit there and then all of a sudden everything gets very stressful. And that's when a lot of students underperform in the exam room. So we've worked with parents, I know this is quite a creative approach, who've basically in the days or the weeks before a test, they've tried to get their son or daughter working in an environment that tried to mirror an exam hall. One mother famously told me that she actually circles around the desk every 10 minutes to mirror what it's like for a student to be writing with an invigilator walking around. We worked with one principal in the UK, one of my favorite examples, who used to hold a mock exam day for his students. And he said, "I want you to come into the exam room and all you're going to do is just work through practice questions, but I'm going to set the hall up like an exam environment." And he said, "I did that every single year." And he said, "It was amazing watching the students go from the first simulated environment to the third or the fourth time I did it, because the third or the fourth time they walked in the hall, they looked around, they said, I've seen this before, I've done this before, I've written practice questions in the same environment," and it just relaxed the students because they were used to that situation. So the short answer that we always promote to students, start by cheating, but then as you get closer to your tests or exams, try to wean yourself off your notes and simulate what that exam day actually looks like. And finally, one of the most missed out steps from students is after the exam or the mock or the practice questions to reflect on what you did well, what you didn't know or where you lost marks, and try to rectify those mistakes before the actual exam room itself. Now, a lot of the work we do at Elevate, starting out as a research company, one of the kind of inspirations that we always draw upon is a psychologist called Kay Anders Ericsson, who spoke a lot about the idea of positive psychology, of deliberate practice, or the 10,000 hour rule. I know a lot of people are familiar with. And this is a really simple quote, but it's one of my favorite quotes to talk to students about because the two examples that I always use, and again, maybe think how this applies to your children. The first example I always use is that famous example of the definition of insanity. Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And I think that's a great analogy for students because if they do the same thing before every test or every exam, they're unlikely to see an improvement in their results. The second question, though, that I always ask students, which is always a funny one, is to imagine that they get a bad result back. They failed an exam, they've done really badly in an assessment. I always ask them the question, what would you do with that actual physical paper? Now, the three answers I get, which are always very amusing. Number one is throw it in the bin and cry. Number two is hide it from my parents so I don't get in trouble. Or number three, which is for some reason the most common answer, is burn it. Have some kind of ritual bonfire, cleanse myself of the result, never look at it again. And I'll give you a very, very inspiring analogy that we talk about with students, and I say that half tongue in cheek. That most students, when they think about assessments or exams or tests, they think about the fact that they're starting on 0% and they have to work their way up to 100%. We always encourage them to flip that and think about their marks like a bucket. And all of the work they've done, all of the content that they've learnt to date fills that bucket up. And every time they make a mistake or they lose a mark, they're leaking water or they're losing some kind of solid from that bucket of water. And the very simple question we ask is, well, what would you do with a leaking bucket? At which point you always have some students say, that's simple, you'd go out and buy a new bucket. That's not the answer we're looking for. It should look to plug those holes or plug that gap. And a really key message we drive home to students is the quickest way that you can increase your marks a lot of the time is just to stop losing marks or stop making the same mistakes you've made before. So how do you do that? To get as practical as possible. One of the families we worked with in Australia, they went through religiously a process with their son or daughter. They didn't push them to do this, but they did it with them once, and they found it so effective that their son and their daughter, they had two children, they started doing this after their tests or exams by their own volition. So whenever they'd done a practice exam or a mock paper, they would go through that paper and they'd basically conduct some kind of analysis on what they got wrong or where they lost their marks. And they used a template similar to what I'm sharing on the screen, where they'd write down, okay, what was the exam or the test that I just did? What was the question that I got wrong or that I made a mistake on? What was the topic that that question referred to? Why was that answer wrong? So why did I get it wrong? And what was the correct answer? And one of the things they're looking for is the pattern in terms of, was it a content issue? I just didn't know the answer. I just didn't know the content well enough. Was it a technique issue? So as an example, my structure was poor, or I didn't answer the question in the way that they were wanting me to. Or the third category, which is a really common one, was it just a silly issue? And by silly, I mean they misread the question. They were asked for 3 reasons and they only provided 2. So was it just one of those slip of the tongue moments? And basically what that process then looks like is they then need to say, okay, well, now that I've diagnosed what I got wrong and why, how do I fix it? And that's where they can ask their teacher, they could ask you as a parent, they could ask another student, or they could try to solve that problem themselves. And the most important part of this entire process, they then redo that question and try to fix that mistake. Now, one of the reasons I say it's the most important part is a lot of students, they'll walk away from a session or they've been given advice before about the importance of practice. And what we see students do a lot of the time, they'll go and they'll try to find practice questions. They'll go to the Elevate student website, they'll download past papers that we have available, and they'll do an entire practice exam. And then they'll leave it sitting on their desk, pat themselves on the back and go, well, I hope I got that right. And even though that's fantastic that they've taken the initiative and they've done that practice paper, they're missing that final step of saying, well, would you have received 93% or would you have received 2% for spelling your first and last name correctly? And they don't actually know how they would have done on the day if that was a real exam. So again, what does this actually look like and how you can use this with your children? So as an example, you might take an exam like it was a mock exam or it was a trial exam. It could be life sciences, just as an example. They'll write down the questions that they got wrong or where they made the mistake. They'll identify the topic that the question came from. They'll write down the reason why they lost marks, and then they'll actually write down the correct answer. And what we find is this gives students an enormous amount of confidence coming into a test or exam, because they know that if they get asked a similar question again, or the same question even, they're more likely to know the answer and be able to get correct marks for that, because they've already gone through that process of fixing the mistake. So a big suggestion I would give to everyone is, in the days and weeks beforehand, try to encourage your son or daughter to set up that kind of mistake bank, look at where they've struggled in the past, and spend that time on the topics that they find the most challenging. If we have any economists on the call, we talk a lot about Pareto's law, that you get 80% of your marks from the 20% of the work that you do. So it's really important to spend most of your time on the key topic areas or the at-risk areas as well. So that's a really practical suggestion for the kind of week or the days leading up to exams. Practice questions, go through them, work out what you got wrong or what you got right, and then try to fix those mistakes before you walk into the exam room or the test for real. Now we're up to the night before the exam or the days before the exam, which some of you may be currently sitting there right now saying, yep, my son or daughter is actually writing tomorrow. And the big phrase that we use for students here is routine sets you free. And a big reason why we found the top performing students in the country did so well in tests and exams is they had a really clear structure, they had a really clear routine that they stuck to every single time that optimized their performance on the day in that test or in that exam. So again, just a bit of a quiz or just some questions to reflect on in terms of your son or your daughter, or for the students who've joined us, think about how these apply to you. I know I'm going to sound a little bit like a nutritionist, and some of these points I'm definitely going to sound like a parent, but what we encourage students to do, first and foremost, is try to drink a lot of water in the lead up to tests and exams. It sounds very, very simple, but just to bring in a prop for this evening's webinar, you'll notice my water bottle sitting next to me here. When I was in grade 11, just as a quick story, there was a student the year above me, a guy called Jacob Taylor, who was basically phenomenally good at everything. He was the best academic in the matric year above me. He learned fluent Mandarin and went over to Beijing to work in the Olympics. He was the vice captain of the Australian Sevens rugby team. So he was basically winning at life, to put it that way. And I will never forget when he was in grade 12, he came in to speak to us in grade 11 and you could hear a pin drop. And I was sitting there waiting for this amazing secret to his success. And he spent about 5 minutes talking to us about the importance of drinking water. Now, as you can imagine, 150 students walked out of that room and instantly started downing water because they latched on to whatever this guy said. But water is one of those things that keeps you hydrated, it keeps you sharp, and there is definitively a link between your focus, your ability to pay attention, and your level of hydration. We always encourage students not to have a big meal or to eat too much before bed, because that has a direct impact on student sleep. And interestingly, there's a correlation between their dreams and nightmares. and the kind of eating before bed. And also a big issue now in 2021 around these. We always try to encourage students to try to avoid really bright lights, LCD screens, because that also has an impact on their sleep. So one of the strategies a lot of parents have talked to me about is they'd literally, set a reminder, and basically half an hour to an hour before bedtime, they would start dimming the lights in their house. Sounds really simple, and with load shedding, that probably shouldn't be a problem for too many of you. The government's going to do that for us. But the idea is to get students into a situation where they're getting closer towards that sleep routine. Finally, we always recommend students don't try to cram too much the night before an exam. The way your memory works is like a sieve, and a lot of students, even though they think that cramming is going to help them, what ends up happening is they've got information coming in to the top of their brain, and then things end up falling out the bottom, or there's so much information flying around in their head that it actually impacts their ability to think clearly. So I know the reality is most students will cram, they will read, they will study the night before an exam, but we always encourage them to either review their trigger words, review their mind maps, or go over their mistake bank. Don't try to sit there and read their entire textbook, because it's just information overload. And again, I'm going to definitely sound like a nutritionist or a sports coach here, but again, exercise, there is a direct correlation between well-being, often with mental health, with students' ability to focus and pay attention, and the level of exercise or physical activity they're doing. Now, I'm not saying go out and do an Ironman or Ironwoman or run a marathon, but even something as simple as walking around the room or standing up and stretching has a direct link between students' ability to pay attention. Some of the don'ts, this probably applies to a lot of us as well in our working world. We always encourage students to try to stay away from caffeine in the late afternoon or at night. Red Bull gives you wings. A lot of the times for students, though, it actually damages their ability to sleep and to pay attention or to focus. Because in order to fall asleep, our melatonin levels naturally rise. And one of the biggest things that suppresses melatonin is caffeine. And what happens is that half-life of caffeine often stays in our system up to 8 hours after drinking a coffee or even tea. So we always encourage students to stay away from energy drinks and caffeine late at night, because how often have you seen it where students have said, no, I need to work, I'm behind, and they cram, and then the next day it's almost a complete write-off because they can't pay attention in class or they lose focus in the exam room. We always encourage students to avoid having a really heavy meal before bed, and avoid as much as possible staring at their screen or playing games that jack up their level of kind of stimulation. It's amazing how many students say to me, yeah, it's really weird. Before bed, I just play Call of Duty for 4 hours and then I lie in bed and I can never fall asleep easily. So we encourage them to come up with some kind of pre-sleep routine, whether it's reading or meditating or just dimming the lights, to help them with that process of switching off and falling asleep. And as I said, cramming last minute, it often does more harm than good. So we just focus on doing the high value work just before an exam, but try not to take in too much information or too much content. To finish this section, one of my big pieces of advice to students is try to come up with some kind of regular routine that you mimic before you have a test or an exam. Some students we worked with would literally eat the same thing before a test or an exam. They would listen to the same song before they went to bed. I had a personal approach when I was at university in Sydney, where I would try to sit as far away from the exam hall as I possibly could, but so that I could still see the door to the exam hall, so I didn't miss the exam and forget. But I would always try to isolate myself from other students. And my golden rule for students is to try to avoid what we call speculators and stress merchants. Now, for the parents on the call, I'm going to take you back to your varsity or your school days. Think about if you ever had a friend who did this. This is what we refer to as a speculator. You'll be standing there outside the exam, trying to relax, trying to stay calm, and your friend will come up to you and do this. So how much work have you done before the exam? I've been averaging about 16 hours a day. Do you think that's enough? It's never really enough. What do you think will come up in the exam? If they ask you, how would you answer that? No, that's wrong. That's not how I would answer that question. And everyone knows someone who just freaks them out because they put too much pressure on them. And stress is contagious, and it does not help students to stand outside the test or the exam room speculating about what could come up or how much work have you done, or I've done every single past exam paper back to 1993. How many have you done? Because that only increases the stress or the anxiety levels. So my approach is I would always, if it was allowed at school, put in my headphones. I would put in, some Hans Zimmer or something. I would try to relax. I would breathe, and I would try to avoid people who would speculate about the exam, because I always found it just put too much more pressure on me that I didn't need. Okay, and some final tips to hopefully help everyone with the exam room itself. Like I said, we speak to a huge number of parents who say things like, my son or daughter's actually pretty fine in the lead up to exams. They work hard, they're doing practice questions, they go to bed early. Their problem is in the exam room itself. So a few really practical things that will hopefully help your children when they're actually writing or they're doing their tests or they're doing their exams. My first suggestion is to ration their time. Now, I say that because one of the biggest pieces of feedback we hear from teachers is that students run out of time in the exam room, and they either miss questions or, more commonly, they spend all of their time on the initial questions that are worth 1 or 2 marks, but they run out of time on the 20-mark question, which is obviously where most of their marks are gained. Now, a really great formula or a strategy you can use here, if this is a problem with your son or daughter, you don't have to be a good math student at all to do this. But the formula we always encourage they use is minutes divided by marks. So in other words, the number of minutes they have to do the test or do the exam divided by the number of marks the test or the exam is worth. So I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'll give you one example, and I'm going to ask you a quiz question just so everyone can work through this yourself. A really good example is if you have 2 hours to do a test or 2 hours to write an exam. That's obviously 120 minutes. If that exam or that test was worth 20 marks, it becomes 120 divided by 20. So you would spend 6 minutes per mark. So as an example, if a question was worth 2 marks, you would spend, nice and simple, hopefully everyone got that one right, 12 minutes on that question. If a question was worth 6 marks, you would spend 36 minutes on that question. And if a question was worth 10 marks, you would spend a full hour on that question. Now, this is generally the first thing we encourage students to do, because one of the problems we find is students get what we call tunnel vision, and they'll get a 1 mark or a 2 mark or even a 5 mark question. They'll get really excited because they know the answer to it, and they'll actually spend way too much time writing down everything they know about that question or that topic. And they end up running out of time on the bigger marks at the end of the exam or the end of the test. And obviously it's not worth spending an extra 20 minutes on a 2-mark question and sacrificing 20 minutes on a 20-mark question. So minutes divided by marks. The next thing we encourage students to do, and I know this sounds very new age and spiritual, but I'm a very, very big proponent of well-being and stress management, because we're seeing more and more issues with young people around anxiety, around stress, and around well-being. So I always encourage students, when they're in the test or the exam environment, take a minute, close the exam paper, close that test paper, close their eyes, and just breathe. Now, that sounds very obvious, I know. But what we encourage students to do, we call it the body scan method, and you're more than welcome to look this up as well. But students should close their eyes. Often with the body scan method, they clench their fist, they focus on something that is tangible, something that is corporeal, something that is, in their body. They breathe in through their nose, they hold it, they breathe out through their mouth, and they repeat. Now, when humans are stressed, we carry most of our stress in one of three places. Number one is our jaw. So next time you're stressed at work, think about your jaw, and a lot of the time you'll be clenching it. Number two is our neck, which, to be self-deprecating for a second, isn't good for me because I've been told since I was about 12 that I have the longest neck in the world. So your neck is the second one. And number three is your shoulders and your back. And often when you're stressed, it's quite funny. People don't even notice this, but your whole body language will be tense. And the other thing people do with their breathing, interestingly, they'll either stop breathing and they won't even notice. They'll be holding their breath, or they start hyperventilating, going. What we encourage students to do is at the beginning of the exam, slow down, close their eyes, and even if it's 30 seconds, breathe in through their nose, hold, breathe out through their mouth, hold, and repeat. It's called circular breathing or box breathing. And then when they start the exam or when they start the test, I mentioned this in the last webinar, but a few really practical tips. Number one, my suggestion is they read through the entire paper or they read the entirety of the questions before they start answering the question. The reason for that is that their brain will subconsciously tick over as they're answering questions 1, 2, 3, 4 and use it to think of possible information or answers for the different questions in the exam. So I always encourage them to read all of the questions in the paper first. The next thing I suggest is that they read every single question before they attempt to answer it twice, and they actually get out a pen or a highlighter and they highlight the key words in the question. So when I say key words, I mean things like evaluate or define or the instructive verb in the question, because there is a big difference between describe and evaluate. Which of these is not a factor in the following? Highlight not. Provide 3 reasons for. Highlight 3 reasons. Because that is where a lot of the silly marks come from, that students just don't read the question properly or they don't actually answer the question. So number 1, read the question. Number 2, read the question again. Number 3, highlight the keywords in the question. And number 4, you may remember me last time talking about using trigger words or mind maps, or the approach that I used to do, which is to try to condense an entire topic's worth of notes into an A4 page, just using shorthand, using symbols, using images. And what I would do at the beginning of the webinar, or the beginning of the exam, I should say, is I'd spend the first couple of minutes and I'd scribble down my notes or my keywords or my trigger words. So the dates that I'd memorized, the formulas, the names of people or places, I'd scribble them down at the start of the exam or test, and then I could come back to them over the next hour or the next 2 hours. And effectively what you're then doing is separating the process of remembering the content and focusing on the application or the use of that information as you go. And all of that cramming and the information flying around in your brain, often it's really helpful just to dump it onto a piece of paper so you're not an hour and 40 minutes into the test frantically trying to remember what you were learning the night before. So there are a few really practical tips, and hopefully that helps both in the final few days before an exam or a test, the night before a test or an exam, but then some of the things you can talk about with your son or daughter in the test or in the exam room itself. And when Elevate works with a school, we actually run a session called Ace Your Exams, very fitting. And this is the exact kind of content that we cover with students in our workshops. When we work with a student on an individual basis through our coaching program, we'll actually work with them to develop that mistake bank checklist. or to work with them on a pre-exam routine so that they're set up for success in that exam or that test. Okay, lovely. I said I will try to finish a little bit early tonight, and I do want to give 5 minutes at least for some questions. So our key takeaways from this evening is to try to limit your mistakes using that bucket analogy, using practice, but doing deliberate practice to focus on areas you need to improve in, and then crucially, trying to fix the mistakes or work on the subjects or the content that you're not that confident in or that you're losing most of your marks in at the moment. Coming up with some kind of pre-test or pre-routine to help students stay calm, manage anxiety, and give them familiarity with that process. And because that familiarity is the biggest thing psychologically that people can latch onto, that relaxes them and keeps them calm. And finally, in the exam room itself, using that minutes over marks, writing down the key information at the beginning, reading every question, highlighting the key words, and then taking that minute just to pause, to think, and not just diving in with that tunnel vision approach, writing down every single thing you know about that topic. Okay, brilliant. And just before we get to questions in the last 5 or 10 minutes, I really hope you found these webinars helpful. Like I said, this is the 5th webinar that we've run this year. There is one more webinar for the term that I'll be running 2 weeks to the day. And that's going to be all around memory skills and memory techniques. I've obviously focused on exams and the exam room process itself, but we often get questions about auditory learning styles, kinesthetic learning, visual learners. We often get asked questions about my son or daughter has ADD or ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Asperger's, whatever the kind of different challenges are that families are facing. So in 2 weeks, I'm going to spend a lot of time looking at memory techniques and learning styles as well. The webinar is free, as always. We've done that deliberately to try to help as many parents as possible. So if you haven't registered, you can also register for that webinar in 2 weeks' time. If you do want to have a chat, you can also book in a time. It's absolutely obligation free to speak to myself or Divan, who runs the coaching program with Elevate. As I mentioned last time, we start that coaching program with a diagnostic assessment, which is basically a study skills interview with your child to determine how they're currently studying, how we think we can help, and then we provide a feedback report, we provide a suggestion for how we can move forward, and then we have a range of resources that's included in that as well. That diagnostic session does have a cost. It's 350 Rand plus VAT. But for that cost, you get the one-on-one assessment, the feedback report, and the online resources as well. So if you would like to have a chat or find out a bit more about coaching, you should be able to see a calendar on that watch page, and you're more than welcome to book in a time to have a chat. Otherwise, in the last 7 minutes that we have, you can fire through any questions that you may have using that chat function. Leandri's going to pass them on to me. I'll answer as many as I can in the last 7 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap it up from there. And you will receive the recording of this webinar as well by the end of tomorrow, and some exam resources that you can use to help in that final kind of stretch before tests and exams. So again, a huge thank you for joining us. I really hope you found that helpful, and all the best. I know it's a stressful period for parents as well. So I wish you all the best for your exams and tests over the next few weeks too. Okay, fantastic. Okay, a couple of questions flying in already. Number one, where can we obtain past exam papers? Very, very common question we get asked. 3 suggestions for you. Number one is ask your child's school. I know that it can be challenging to access papers at times, but first and foremost, you should ask your child's school. They often have resources, whether they have actual past exam papers or can steer you in the right direction towards practice questions at the back of the chapters in the book or any additional resources. Number 2 is often websites like the DBE website, depending on the school system your son or daughter follows. the IEB website, if they follow the Cambridge system or the CAPS curriculum, look online, because often there are past papers that are published on the exam board or the curriculum websites as well. And as a reminder, we've tried as far as possible to compile practice questions, past papers, and memos. As a reminder, if you just go to elevateeducation.com, we do have a student portal where the password is Springbok, and we've tried to compile some practice questions for grade 4 to matric, for IEB and the NSC curriculum as well, and they're on that website as well. We are busy trying to find more papers. It is challenging because we need to get permission before we publish them, but you can use the Elevate website as well that has papers on there. Okay, next question. Is it better to study with a partner or alone? Again, great question. The short answer to that is it depends on how your son or daughter works. Some students find working in a group really distracting, and they're much more efficient and productive when they're working by themselves. Personally, I used to enjoy a mix where I would study by myself, I'd do a practice question by myself, but then I would actually get one of my friends, and as a study buddy or as a study group, I would actually go through past papers and practice questions with my friend. So I found it the best of both worlds. It helped me to focus because I could work alone, but then I used my friends to bounce ideas off, to share kind of how you would answer that question, or what you would put in a kind of response to this question. And as I mentioned last time, one of the best ways to learn anything is to teach it. So I strongly encourage students, if they are going to work in a group, one of the best ways they can do that is to teach the content to somebody else in their group. It's one of the best ways to reinforce content, but actually demonstrate understanding. But a quick question, are the practice papers available to people who are not registered for coaching? Yes, absolutely. The student website is free, irrespective of whether you work with us through the coaching program or not. You can access that student website. Like I said, the password is Springbok. That doesn't cost you anything. You can log into that website this evening and access those resources. There are also video tips and blog posts as well. So we've tried to develop a kind of one-stop shop for students. That's absolutely free of charge, yes. If there are no practice papers available from the school, should we as parents make mock tests? You absolutely can. I think that is a brilliant way to get involved to help your son or daughter. I would actually flip it though, and I would actually say one of the best things to do is see if you can get your son or daughter to write their own mock tests. Now, I know that might sound a little bit strange, but to come back to my point about the syllabus in the last webinar, there's only a fixed number of topics that students can get asked in a test or in an exam. And what I mean by that is obviously they've already been taught that content or that theme has been covered in class. So I would actually say to your son or daughter, what do you think they're going to ask you in that test or that exam? Or if you were writing a test or an exam for another student to do, what would you ask them? I think it's a great way to get students thinking about what topics are likely to come up, and then they can work through it and say, okay, well, and how would you answer that question? What would your response be if that does come up? And as a bit of a game you can play with your children, see how many themes or topics or questions they can come up with that do actually come up in the test or the exam. Because I think most of the time they'll be amazed whether the question might change or the phrasing is different, but obviously the theme or the topic should come up again. How do I help my child stick to their study timetable? You may have joined us for the time management webinar we ran at the start of the year. If you didn't, we can send through the recording for that webinar, because I did spend about an hour talking about this exact topic. I know it's a very challenging one. As a summary, don't try to make a study timetable too far in advance, because nobody knows what they're doing in 6 weeks' time and what subject they're going to be studying on a Tuesday at 4 p.m. So I always suggest that students make a timetable a week in advance as a rolling timetable. Only do it for the next 7 days. Put in the fun stuff first, put in their breaks, put in their exercise, put in their social times, fit the study around it, and stick it up somewhere visible like a fridge or a wall where there is accountability and where you as parents can encourage your students to stick to it as well. Okay, and the last question, I see we've just ticked over 7 o'clock. If we didn't get to your questions, apologies. We will go through them over the next day and get back to them all. So the last question we have here is, this is a good one. Just listening to classical music enhance studying. It's probably one of the most common questions we get asked, is listening to music good or bad? The short answer is it can be a big distraction because listening to music with lyrics or a beat is what we refer to as memory disruption. And it's really challenging when students are trying to learn information and they're reading information or writing notes and they've got lyrics coming in their ear. It's really hard for their brain to process that information. I'll give you a quick IQ test to work on this evening. Put your 2 pointer fingers or your 2 index fingers in front of your face. Try to move one of them forwards and at the same time move the other one backwards. Should look something like this, but when most people try to do that, they take about 10 minutes and they stare at their fingers like they've never seen them before. And that's just a very silly but a very practical way to show you how hard we find it to multitask. The biggest problem with music, like I said, are lyrics and a beat. So classical music can help because it can help students relax, it can help them to focus, and it doesn't have the same impact with memory disruption. So it is definitely better than listening to rap music or listening to music with 100 words a minute coming in your ear, because that's quite disruptive to the learning process. Okay, again, thank you so much for joining. I've had a few parents just say, how can we access the recordings if this is the first webinar you have joined? The good news is we do record all of these webinars. I know parents are exceptionally busy and often can't join these in the evenings. My email address is just adam@elevateeducation.com. You would have received a confirmation email from me. You also should have received a reminder email this evening saying we're live in an hour, just as a reminder. Check your junk folder because sometimes it does go through to your junk email. You're more than welcome to get in touch with me and we can send you through the recordings of all of the other webinars as well. But otherwise, I will leave it there. Thank you so much again for joining. I really hope you found that helpful. All the best to your children over the coming days and weeks. Remember the process and they'll be absolutely fine. And I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks at the next webinar on memory skills and learning styles.